Hello and welcome to the Anatomy for Artists course online with me, Scott Eaton. And this is the first lecture in the 8-week lecture series on anatomy. And I wanted to start out with a little introduction about myself. And I've been doing art for probably as long as I can remember, but I've also kind of taken a twofold path. So I practice mainly in computer graphics, and half of my background is technical and half is artistic. So my approach to anatomy is informed both by kind of as a visual artist, but also as an engineer, which is what I originally studied. So a lot of the mechanics are interesting to me in anatomy, and kind of the whole understanding of the body is very important when it comes to deformation and articulation and all sorts of things when the body starts to move. So I will try to impart a little bit of my understanding of not just the surface anatomy and the form and the shape, which is all very artistic things, but also a little bit of the mechanics and the mechanisms and the functions of the body, which is important for understanding, again, how the body shape changes when the body moves. So I wanted to go through a little bit of the work that I've done recently and show you it's all quite focused on the figure, which is what you would expect teaching an anatomy course. But I suppose a lot of the stuff that I'm going to teach you over the next 8 weeks comes from the lessons that I learned in Florence. I was down there studying for a short while, not as long as some, and I think actually I stayed the right amount of time, because there is a danger in studying in this very academic tradition of your work becoming very stale. Because it is purely study and there's very little room for self-expression. And to give you an example, these drawings on this page are all life drawings, so done from the model, and probably some of you out there do life drawing yourselves. And to give a little perspective, these drawings were not kind of your standard life drawing, figure drawing session drawings where you stand in front of the model for 10, 20, 30 minutes, maybe an hour pose, maybe 2-hour poses. These, in kind of the pure academic tradition, were 5-week poses done every day for 3 hours for 5 weeks. So the model would have their feet, their hands, their arms marked a place that they would look at every day for 3 hours. And you would draw, staring at the figure, the same pose for quite a long time. And it's an exercise in seeing and coordination between hand and eye, but the thing that it gives you is just staring at the figure for so long is a familiarity with the body and the to's and fro's of the muscles, origins and insertions. And I mean, it's very visual exercise drawing, but if you combine it with study on the side, so anatomy study like we're going to present in this course, the combination is very, very powerful. And so what we're going to teach throughout the next 8 weeks is the fundamentals, kind of the very foundation of anatomy. And it's going to be largely theoretical, kind of the information that you need to know to understand how the body works and the shapes that it makes. But then you're going to need to augment this with your own visual library and your own visual experience. So doing drawings from life, doing drawings from reference, doing digital sculptures from reference, sculptures from life. All of these things help to build up your own mental library to really round out your knowledge of anatomy, because it's one thing to understand fundamentally how it works. The second level is to understand how it looks in life and drawings, and to be able to translate that. So this is some of the kind of the traditional artwork that I started from. And then kind of at the same time, I've always worked digitally, and the advent of a lot of these new digital tools like ZBrush and Mudbox give you really, really powerful opportunities to prototype and work up digital sketches, kind of 3-dimensional sketches, in a way that they used to do with clay, but we have so much more flexibility and freedom to do digitally, to change proportions, to change volumes, to change shapes. There's incredible freedom And so it really is a good way to learn and to experiment. And this digital sculpture that you see in front of you is a study from another artist, 19th century French artist, from kind of this golden age of French figure sculpture and figure drawing in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. And they really had captured some of the essence of the body in kind of the highest sense of any tradition, you know, from the Renaissance to present day. And so a lot of the lessons that we're going to talk about in this course come from this period of the French Academy, because they really achieved kind of the pinnacle of figurative representation. So we'll refer back to these guys quite a few times. And this is by a French artist, and it's a study from his work. So I was looking for a lot of the things that he understood, trying to represent it in my own sculpture. And this is another valuable way to study from the masters, because when you study their marks and their lines, you're seeing what they understood about the body. And they're kind of, through their own filter, they're filtering out the things that are superfluous or things that aren't common between bodies. So it's a very useful way to study. So this was a work you might have seen a little bit of the making of on Pixologic's website. If not, you can visit there. I think it's still on one of the links under the learning section. This is another digital sketch that I worked on in the last year, and this was really a study of animal anatomy. And the very last lecture in this 8-week series is an introduction to animal anatomy and creature anatomy, because a lot of the stuff that we're going to learn about human anatomy has really, really profound and direct translations into animal anatomy. So you can almost think of what we're learning in this next couple months as a broad foundation for you to continue to explore both human anatomy, but also to use it as a launching point for going off and understanding and studying how to build believable animals and creatures. For example, I'll just do a little markup on this slide, because this is going to be a lot of what I do during these lectures, which is drawing over my slides to try to give you additional information and to show you how things actually fit together on the figure. Everybody hopefully is familiar with tricep on a human, back of your arm. If you're not familiar, a very, very starting point, but we'll cover it in next week's lecture, or the third week's lecture, I believe. But on a horse, everybody's familiar, I hope, just kind of visually in your mind, with this big mass sitting on the side of the chest, of the thorax of the horse. This is actually a horse's tricep muscle. And it gets huge because it's one of the primary movers of the horse. And it's kind of not well understood that that's the exact analog of our own tricep muscle. They have a bicep muscle in the front, and it's right in here. Very small, though. But it's a bicep muscle, just like our bicep muscle. And given those two, this makes this the horse's elbow, and this is his forearm. You know, all of the extensor muscles of our wrist and fingers sit on the back of our forearm, and likewise with the horse, right there, and flexor muscles on the opposite side. So amazing analogies between humans and animals, quadrupeds, other vertebrates. So we'll explore this more in the last lecture, but this is kind of a result of one of my own personal studies, really trying to get in depth into sculpting the animal form. And this kind of is another point that when you're working, and hopefully I can impress this upon you throughout the duration of the course, that there should be no areas of the body, human or otherwise, that are a mystery to you. I know when I was working a long time ago, there were areas where I didn't know what was going on, like the back, and that's going to be is a very difficult area to understand. We'll cover it in exquisite detail. But when you get to these areas in your work, you should realize that there is a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge of what's going on there, and use that as a chance to investigate what is meant to be in that area rather than a chance to gloss over it and fake it. Because we've all done it. I mean, if I asked you to raise your hand if you faked the back muscles, I'm sure almost without exception 100% of you would say in your own work, whether it's sculpture, drawing, concept work, painting, that you have had to make up the lumps and bumps in the back. And it's a bit unfortunate when you have to do that because things fall out of place. And so through the course of these lectures, I'm going to try to explain to you every little bit that has gone into something like this study. Everything in here are things that we're going to talk about. All these muscles, these shapes, these forms, the transition from origin to insertion, directions of pull. As soon as you start to understand the body, it's just like one big puzzle. And the nice thing about a puzzle is, especially kind of the human puzzle, muscles and skeleton, is that it doesn't really change. It changes volume and proportions. If somebody's muscular, if somebody's slight, but it doesn't actually change construction. So if you've done the puzzle once, the second time you'll be faster at putting it together. Third time you'll be even faster. And after you've done it a large number of times, everything just falls into place. And when that happens, you're able to work very fast and very creatively. Some of the digital maquettes that I'll show you in a couple slides, you'll probably be amazed at the speed that they're put together. And it's not that it's especially amazing, but it's just the process of working through the figure and understanding the figure over and over again makes things very fast. And that's one of the kind of fringe benefits of studying a lot and understanding a lot is, as a byproduct, you become very fast. And when you're fast, it's easier to be creative. Okay, so this is just a work in progress. You can see that he doesn't have a tail, and some of the things are a little bit ill-formed, and he's bald. But a good kind of midway starting point. Okay, and then the female figure. This was for a tutorial in 3D World magazine, which the link is to a PDF is on my website if you want to read through it. It's quite involved. It's a long tutorial on female figure sculpture in ZBrush or ZBrush. And some of the things, this is, again, something that we'll cover in the course. I think it's the second to last week, we start to talk about gender variations and what the difference is fundamentally between a man and a woman, other than the obvious. But just to save you the mystery, men and women are exactly the same. It's differences in proportion and differences in fat distribution that are the critical differences. Musculature, skeleton, they're exactly the same. So we just have to change proportions and know where fat tends to accumulate. And so, just quickly going through what we see on here. We have these areas where sculpturally we treat them as hard points, to learn how to work with softness and hardness. So areas where there's inflections and concavities and convexities, areas that are nice and round and soft are treated differently than something that we'll call landmarks. All right, we locate these on the skeleton. This is going to be later on in this first week of lecture. We're going to talk a lot about skeletal landmarks because skeletal landmarks are areas on the skeleton that we can count on to be reliable markers for us to start with to transition and string muscles to and from. And so we're going to really build up the foundation of our knowledge of the skeleton in this first week so that we can use that as a reference point to start to lay muscles over. So really you have to build the foundation of the house before you can put the upper levels on. And that's what the skeleton is to us. Okay, so as promised, here are a few digital maquettes that I've been working on recently. Very quick studies, and these are always done under time constraint. And they're really just sketches to get out the idea. And hopefully I'll give you a tour of some of these actually in 3D as the course goes on. I'll talk about some of the relevant anatomy in the weeks that we're looking at it, just so that you can really see how I think about the different points on the skeleton, the different structures, and how, when you're not working totally realistically, that you can use that knowledge to exaggerate form. In this case, we're talking about, doing a sketch, kind of a digital sketch, a digital clay sketch of a giant. This was a day of work in total, broken up over a few sessions, but about 2 hours at a go for 3 days or 4 days to get this together. So 8 hours probably total. Not to say that's the amount of time spent working in front of the computer digitally in ZBrush. I had actually done and thought about the form and the anatomy beforehand in my sketchbook, doing sketches and studies, and I'll put some of those up actually because I think they're probably interesting to look at relative to this, so maybe that'll be in next week's lecture. And so really, since we're talking about bony landmarks in this week's lecture, I'm just going to go through here and make a few marks on relevant structure in advance of really getting into the details in front of you about where things are and the names and the shapes of the skeleton. But things that are really important, to this construction are the pelvis. Like this is a really, really powerful giant, and what happens is their bones grow disproportionately, and their muscles don't keep up with the growth, so they stop growing everywhere else, but their bones continue to enlarge. And so for this guy, he ends up having a big bowl of a pelvis and really protruding hip bones. And these, hopefully you can feel, are treated as more skeletal. Large, blocky knees, because the joints kind of become much larger than the muscles surrounding them. So you get a distribution of different lie of muscles than you would on a human figure, where the muscles are roughly in proportion to the joints. We'll talk about these landmarks up here on the elbow and the forearms. Again, critical for helping us place the flexor muscles of the forearms, the muscles that grip your hands and flex your wrist forward, and then on the back side, what's called extensor muscles. Again, a very, very difficult area to study. The extensor muscles of the forearm, and the construction of the scapula area, the upper back, are the two hardest parts on the body, and we'll cover those in a lot of detail. So you'll become very, very familiar with the structures. So that's one kind of digital sketch that I've been working on recently. And here's another little fun sketch, and it looks a little bit whimsical, and it is. I mean, the guy is meant to be a kind of a Frankenstein assemblage of parts, so big arm, small arm put together from other dead people, so he has a big arm sitting onto a relatively lean torso, one little man boob here sitting down there onto his really kind of beer belly tummy, but a fairly lean chest on the other side, a lean arm on this side, and again, two different sized legs, right? So different musculature, different volumes on both legs. And when we get a chance, when we talk about some of these things, I'll bring this digital model up and we'll spin around it. And you'll see, I'll talk through how the anatomy, when you're building even something that's kind of an imaginary collection of parts, becomes very important. Because you're still using the same kind of puzzle pieces that we talked about before. They're just different shapes and different sizes. So what ends up happening is you have a different direction of pull of muscles, and the muscles lie in different directions and different path from origin to insertion. And we'll cover all this stuff in detail. Okay, and here is one that has also been on my website, and this was a few years ago now. And this is what we're looking at is one of my first chances to work with, to use the word digital maquette. And what I was attempting to study, and this was for a talk at a museum called the Tate Modern in London, and the idea of the whole experiment was to take our modern day digital tools and see if we could use them to replace this not ancient, but fairly old process of building clay wax maquettes as preliminary studies for large figure sculptures, actually large three-dimensional real-life figure sculptures. Because people may or may not realize it, but things like Michelangelo's David or any of the masterworks of Bernini didn't come straight from chisel into marble. As you can imagine, that a wealthy patron is probably commissioning all these things from these great Renaissance and Baroque artists and says, here's the equivalent of $100,000 to create me a beautiful statue. I'm not just going to trust that you deliver me something fantastic. I want to see preliminary studies. I want to see drawings. I want to see sketches. I want to see clay figures come to me for approval. In much the same way as you'd work now. You need to get approval before you take somebody's huge investment and spend it. And so they would build wax and clay maquettes, often 30 different versions of it to get to the final point. And when the maquette was approved, they would take this and they would send it to their workshop, and they would have a lot of artisans enlarge it and through a very mechanical process build it out of stone. So carve into the marble with very measured drills and chip away all the excess until you're left with a very rough-hewn proportional enlargement of the maquette, clay or wax, whatever the case may be. And so the experiment was to use ZBrush to do the exact same thing. And so, because the tool is very powerful, for people who haven't used it out there, it allows you to very easily change proportions, to change pose, to change volumes. And that's really the point that we're looking at here, is the expression. It's developed to the point where I'm happy with the pose, I was happy with the volumes, and the details are more or less finished, but feet, hands, face, not entirely finished, because I knew this was just a preliminary start for the bigger sculpture. So how do you take the digital data and create something large out of it? Well, here's a little bit about the construction process and what we started with, and I'll tell you a little story before we go ahead about how Michelangelo did the David, because his maquette, his wax study, was destroyed, and he destroyed almost without exception all of his studies because he didn't want people to know how hard he worked to get to the end result that he had. But contemporary accounts of Michelangelo, a guy named Vasari, wrote a chronicle of the artists' lives of the time. And Michelangelo was one of his friends and acquaintances, and so he knew that the process and the whole story behind David. And what happened was this block of marble was just lying around in a quarry for years, and nobody was a huge block of marble, 30 feet tall, and no artist was capable of transforming it. People had chipped away at it, but couldn't make anything productive out of it, so it was just lying waste. And then it was gifted to Michelangelo with the assumption that he would do something fantastic. And so he was going to do David. And the way that he ended up approaching this monumental sculpture is he did a 14-inch tall wax maquette of David, red wax, 14 inches tall, and finished it to a level where it looked like the big David. It probably looks like one of the replicas that you can buy anywhere around Florence today if you go down there. But what he did and how he enlarged his study to something so big as the real David is he immersed his red wax maquette into a vat of water. And by all accounts, Michelangelo had a photographic memory. So each day when he came in to the workshop, he would let a little bit of the water out. And the very first time he let it out enough so that the top ring of the maquette's head was exposed, and he would look at the shape of the ring and kind of commit it to memory, and then he would climb up the scaffolding onto this enormous block of marble and carve out the exact same shaped ring from the top of the marble. Next day, he would let a little more water out and cut out another ring of the exact same shape. And sequentially, from top down, he would carve a number of contours. And collectively, when stacked top down, you had the rough outline of David, and the rest was finishing once the gesture and balance was in place. And so the idea for me with this study was to take digital tools, once this is finished, to size this to be the right height, and in this case, life size. So this is probably equivalent of a 5'10" woman. And using digital techniques again, I took slices through the entire sculpture, top to bottom, more or less equally spaced. Some places where there was more information, I put 2 slices, 5 and 10 centimeters apart. And I sent those out to be laser cut. So I ended up with an Adobe Illustrator file with a bunch of contours like this. A little bit like a puzzle. A bunch of rings with holes for the armature. Sent that out, got them back laser cut out of plywood, and stacked them up, and this is what you get. The volume and the balance of the original digital maquette. Without the detail, obviously, but enough to get started and be assured that the process would end with the right size and the right shape to the figure. They're really the hardest things to establish in traditional sculpture. And if you haven't seen it, this is what the construction process looks like on my website. But I'll play it again here. So people ask how long did it take, and the actual construction was very fast because everything was in place and I could proceed with confidence. And so really it was just me throwing clay onto the figure as fast as I could. And in the end it was about 2 weeks from start to finish, working 3 days a week on other projects. So it came together very quickly. And it was under a deadline again because I had to give the talk at the Tate and get it cast first. So I didn't actually have time to waste. You can see the face come in. And shortly you'll see an ear. And so what you're seeing is, here comes the ear. Sometime. There it is. So what you're seeing is me taking a photograph after every kind of handful of clay. There's the turntable. Okay, and the final piece looks like this after it was cast, and with all her accessories, including a 3rd generation iPod Nano. A good result and validation of the process. So the digital tools are fantastic, but it is great to have something physical in the end. Okay, so why are we actually here? What is the end state of all this talk that I'm doing? It is to get you excited about learning anatomy for games, visual effects, traditional artwork, games, visual effects, art, etc. Whatever your mode of expression, this is all meant to be foundation material for you to do better work in whatever means you express it. Because it's just a tool. Anatomy is a tool, just the way that your tablet is a tool, your paintbrush is a tool, your chisel is a tool. And as soon as you can internalize how it works, then you're free to express and create with it. So, as a very kind of maybe daunting introduction, I'm going to show you this image. And this is what we need to understand through and learn through the next 8 lectures. You need to be able to look at this master drawing and tell me, be able to describe every lump and bump that this guy has indicated on here. Again, it's what I mentioned earlier. A master's drawing is a filter to kind of the purest sense of anatomy, because he gets rid of color, he gets rid of any misread forms, and he understands it, so he conveys it with a little more clarity than, say, a photograph. Not that photography isn't excellent, because we'll use quite a bit of it in this 8 weeks. Okay, so what I'm talking about is this. You need to look at something like that and be able to tell me why that's there and what that is. This is a bony landmark. We saw it on the giant. We saw it on some of the other studies. It's a bony landmark called the greater trochanter of the femur. Right, a big kind of bump, kind of your hip bone sticking out on the side. It's always there, man, woman, fat or thin. So you locate it. Critical point here, something else we need to know. All these things that I'm about to outline are shapes, origins and insertions of muscle, landmarks that we need to be able to locate quickly, because they're all critical to the construction process. Things like this rear head of the deltoid muscle. The muscles going in there. Trapezius muscles coming down here. A muscle here. Look at this edge. And again, I would ask a survey, and if you're sitting in front of me, I could say, what is that? Why is that line there? And if anybody told me that that was the bottom extremity of a muscle called the tensor fasciae latae, I would say that you probably don't need to be taking this course because you understand enough. But that's what it is. There is a muscle on the hip that helps to abduct the leg, called the tensor fasciae latae. And it transmits its force all the way down to here via thickened kind of tendon called the iliotibial band. Again, I'm just talking to show you how much there is to know. None of this should scare you because we're going to cover it in exquisite detail and hopefully with great clarity. Another landmark right here, head of the fibula, patella, freebie. This up here, a massive extensor and flexor muscles of the arm, and we'll talk about those in our forearm lecture. Again, one of the hard parts to understand, but everything here is very meticulously indicated. And if I just step forward one slide, you'll see the end result of something that we call an écorché drawing, which is drawing the flayed figure, trying to draw without the skin. And this is an exercise that we're going to use quite heavily in this course, because in my assessment, it is a fantastic way to study anatomy back and forth. So not only are you learning in the process of outlining the muscles, the direction and flow, origin and insertion, but at the same time as you're doing that, you're also getting the added reinforcement of seeing how this looks on the surface, whether it's a photograph or whether it's a life drawing. You're seeing how this underlying structure is actually represented on the surface of the body, with skin, with fat. So you're getting a double benefit. You're getting structure and construction in addition to the actual surface shapes and form, which is what you ultimately want to represent. Infraspinatus muscle, spine of the scapula, medial border of the scapula. All these things are critical, and we're going to cover them. So without any further ado, this introduction is finished, and we're going to go into proportions next, because proportions, as uninteresting as they may sound, are actually as critical as the skeleton to getting your forms to look good. In advance of muscles, in advance of skin, of details, of striations, you need to have your things shaped correctly. So that's why we put proportions as the next lecture. See you in a couple minutes.